I respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation upon whose ancestral lands I live, work and play. I recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. I would like to pay respect to the elders both past and present, acknowledging them as the traditional custodians of knowledge for this land, a land that was stolen, never ceded and will always be Aboriginal land. Hi, my name's Natalie Krikowa and I'm a Senior Lecturer in Communication and Media at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia. The creative practice research I'll be showcasing today critically examines the evolution of queer representation in screen media and interrogates whether meaningful progress has been made. Queer Representation Matters is an online interactive documentary that explores historical and contemporary issues of queer representation in screen media in Australia and overseas. Let me now show you the opening sequence that introduces the documentary. For a bit of background, the catalyst for Queer Representation Matters stems from the death of Lexa, a queer female character on the CW's 𝗏𝗏, back in April of 2016. Lexa's demise, along with numerous other queer female characters during what queer fans came to refer to as the Spring Slaughter of 2016, underscored a harmful pattern within television narratives. This trend that sees queer characters killed off their shows, usually to advance the straight character storyline, is commonly known as the bury your gays trope, and it's been shown to perpetrate harmful messages to LGBTIQA+ audiences, reinforce stereotypes, and minimise representation. Screen Australia's Seeing Ourselves, Reflections of Diversity in TV Drama report from 2016 further highlighted the lack of inclusive storytelling in Australian scripted TV, revealing that only a small fraction of characters were identifiably LGBTIQA+. Such limited representation fails to reflect the diversity of contemporary society and sends a message of marginalisation to queer audiences. Contemporary portrayals of LGBTIQA+ individuals have often been marred by negative stereotypes and tokenistic representation. Queer media scholars have illustrated how contemporary portrayals of LGBTIQA+ people have emerged from a long history of negative mainstream representations, both in the US and in Australia. Until recently, queerness was either omitted from mainstream film and television, or if it was represented, was often portrayed as distasteful, depressing, or deviant. The prevailing narrative in mainstream media has perpetrated the notion that queer characters are destined for tragedy and trauma, contributing to the emergence of tropes like the bury your gays trope and more recently the cancel your gays. So bury your gays refers to the killing of LGBTIQA+ characters, usually lesbian or bisexual women, often because they are queer, or simply to advance the story of the cis heterosexual, usually male, character. Whereas the cancel your gays trope refers to the entertainment streaming services like Netflix, Disney and Amazon Prime cancelling queer-themed or queer-led shows after 1 or 2 seasons. This research aims to scrutinise the evolution of queer representation in screen media and assess whether meaningful change has actually occurred. By exploring the persisting impact of harmful tropes on queer audiences, this study further seeks to reveal why queer representation matters. Now to talk a little bit about the methodology. So this research pioneers the use of interactive online documentaries, or iDocs, to disseminate academic insights on queer representation to a broader audience outside of the academy. The Queer Representation Matters iDoc employs a concentric nodal structure, offering users the flexibility to explore the content as they desire. This structure follows key principles laid out by Donald and Galloway, 2013, which aims to create a website that was visually interesting, easily navigated, and which used quality materials, and most importantly, provided a seed, something intriguing that would attract users to the website. And in this case, the persistent question is, why does representation matter?
Representation matters to me because it's incredibly powerful. It's incredibly powerful to see yourself on screen. It's incredibly powerful to not see yourself on screen. And you know, as a young lesbian growing up, not seeing yourself on screen or only seeing negative portrayals of LGBTQIA+ characters has a detrimental effect on who you are. I think if I had seen more positive queer content on screen, it would have helped me to come out earlier. It would have changed my perception of myself and my self-esteem. And so I think representation has the ability to not only have a positive impact on people, but also have a negative impact.
And not even just by seeing that person, but also being able to create, you know, if you were someone who couldn't find a community, being able to create a community around a love of a character, you know, is been a really important. There's a reason why I think fan fiction is so ingrained in queer communities, because it harbored communities. It was people that, you know, knew that they, you know, had a love for a character or a person, you know, who was like them, and they could use that love of that person to then find other people who were feeling the same way. I think that's how I think representation can be the most powerful, is when people can build a community around a beloved character.
By pushing for that kind of representation, because it is so necessary, and you know, even in children's television, which is something I've been working on myself recently, that if children can see themselves on screen in their children's, you know, in children's programming, what a difference that would make to be able to have that from the beginning, rather than having to look, you know, under beds and behind closets to find just a decent representation of your own self in some way.
I think it can be quite isolating to be in a minority. You know, you walk through the world and you feel othered, you feel like you're not accepted. I mean, it's only recently we have marriage equality, and that the whole fight for that was traumatic, and things aren't great still. You know, you walk through the world and you feel like you're not accepted, and there are small you know, homophobic comments that people make. And so I think representation brings the community together. It makes the community feel like they're seen and that they're worthy.
So I think being able to see positive representation on your screens, particularly if you're someone that maybe can't see that in your direct life or your family or where you sit in the world, I think it's still incredibly important.
If we do representation right and we do it well, I think it can really change people's perception of themselves, but also create more allies, and also for people to open their minds. So if they see a trans person on screen, if someone watches First Day and they think they've never met a trans person before, then next time they do meet a trans person, they might be more open to that and might be more willing and more accepting. I think screen stories, we watch them on our phones, they're so intimate, we watch them in our homes, that you can really make a connection with the audience, and that connection is really powerful.
The documentary draws from interviews with queer screen media scholars, screen practitioners, and film festival curators to investigate storytelling tropes such as bury your gays and cancel your gays within an industrial context, to highlight the importance of representation of queer people and stories in screen media. The main feature of the iDoc is the historical timeline, which consists of a curated selection of 40+ video clips interviews, and textual examples spanning decades. The user is dropped into a specific moment in time, the death of 𝗥𝗲𝗄 in 2016, and this discussion of the bury your gays trope.
In the year before 𝗥𝗲𝗄 was killed off, the 100 had actually been celebrated for its representation of queer characters. So the character of Clark was the first openly bisexual character on US cable television ever. Okay, so articles were being written about the 100 being the bravest show on TV, how Clark was a turning point in queer representation on TV, and then episode 13, 𝗥𝗲𝗄 was killed off. So she and Clark had finally consummated their relationship, and then a minute later, 𝗥𝗲𝗄 was shot dead, struck by a stray bullet. The fan backlash was immediate and immense. Okay, so fans flooded social media, venting their frustration, but also collectively grieving. The writer and executive producer of the show, 𝗏𝗏𝗲 𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏, actually made himself available on Tumblr to listen to and acknowledge a lot of the fans' reactions. So they were telling him and explaining to him why they were so devastated, why it was so painful, and how these tropes are so harmful. And he was one of the few people connected with the production to really acknowledge the pain that the fans were going through. And he explained that, yes, the writers knew about the trope, and yet they still went through with it. So there was a sense that they had kind of ticked that box, like from what they had already achieved with queer representation for this show up to that point, had already ticked that diversity box or shown that they were allies and that the queer audiences mattered to them. And so they thought maybe they could get away with it, that they had done enough that then they could employ this trope and the fans would, instead of being upset, they would instead appreciate the incredible plot twist that her death played in the show.
Absolutely, like the bury your gays as a thing, particularly in TV land and like mainstream TV land, is a massive problem, and it's still a massive problem. And I think one of the reasons it happens is the fact that you don't have enough queer people in the writers' room, and so they don't have that knowledge. Obviously when 𝗥𝗲𝗄 died in the 100, and it kind of created this sort of moment in popular culture where people were aware of it. I think one of the reasons why that happened so much is that the showrunners and people who are in charge of that film were so interactive with their fans, in particularly on Twitter and things like that, and they were kind of egging people on about this whole experience and this whole sort of like love story, and then to do the most tropey thing in the world, like in the scene after they finally consummate their how was it, 3 seasons? I don't even know. Was horrifying, and it was like if there'd been a queer woman in that writer's room, they would have been like, you can't do that. You can't do that in the next scene. Like, that is a ludicrous thing to do.
The slaughter of 2016, so the first 6 months where all those queer characters were being killed off, it was happening when there were debates around same-sex marriage in the US and here in Australia. And so it was in the public consciousness about the marginalisation, the discrimination that queer people face in their everyday lives. And then to have that translated in the writing room on screen through queer deaths, again, it was just this level of callousness and complete disregard for the cultural context of this trope.
From there, users can move backwards or forwards in time to explore how these issues and themes have evolved over the last 100 years. Users are invited to navigate the historical trajectory of queer representation in media. The inclusion of diverse voices, from academia, the media industry, and queer communities underscores the pervasive nature of harmful stereotypes and tropes in media representation. For example, in the first clip on the timeline, academics discuss the Hays Code, a morality-based production code introduced in Hollywood from 1934 to 1968.
I guess when I think about the Hays Code, I think about it as something that wasn't just eliminating queer identities, but it was about pretty much all forms of sexuality and other things such as like violence and drugs in cinema in the US, so that film culture abided by a really particular sanitized moral code. Actually, the thing I find quite interesting about it, though, is that it didn't really entirely eliminate queerness on screen, but it created a situation where queerness was kind of bubbling beneath the surface, where it was not visible to those who weren't really looking for it.
Through a curated selection of video clips, interviews, and textual examples spanning decades, users are invited to traverse the historical trajectory of queer representation in media. The iDoc transcends traditional academic boundaries, leveraging participatory digital media to democratize access to discussions of media representation. By engaging media professionals, students, and wider audiences in interactive dialogue, this project fosters greater understanding and empathy for the importance of representation in media narratives. By bridging scholarly theory with creative practice, the project advocates for more authentic and inclusive storytelling, challenging both creators and audiences to demand better representation. The final clip on the timeline asks if there's been any improvement in queer representation on screen.
We're at a place now where there's just objectively more queer representation than ever before. It's kind of just gone on this upward trajectory. What's really difficult is that the amount of queer representation in media doesn't equal good representation. So there's like numerically more, but a question about what kind of representation that is, how much there's still kind of old tropes circulating, like bury your gays obviously is just won't go away, but also then the kind of characters that you have and the complexity of queer representation, like the, you know, queer people being able to be kind of whole people in these representations and not just like queer and that's their personality.
It's not all sort of parades and presents, because you can see it as quite cynical in some ways as well, because now queerness has cultural capital attached to it. So you can make a show with good elements of diversity within it, and that's going to give your show some extra credit within the certain areas of our culture at this time. So that can be a great thing, but it can also mean that it's done in not necessarily really productive ways. And I guess the reason it happens doesn't matter so much as the impact that it has. But if you look at even the representation of trans people, that it's getting better now, but for many years, even once there were some good representations of trans people in film and television, it was a very particular type of trans person.
We're not where we need to be, and we're not where we need to be because there isn't the range of experiences on screen that we need to see. There's, I don't know how many series we've had about straight white male doctors. You know, in Australia, it's like, let's just do another one. But it feels like once we've made one LGBT show that people are like, okay, we've done it, let's move on. And same with diversity in all regards. I think we still need to be having those conversations. We're not creating the breadth of content that we need. So I think that that's something that's ongoing that we have to keep talking about, and we have to keep people accountable, and we have to keep creating opportunities.
We should keep campaigning and demanding for more diverse representation. I often feel like I have to choose between my identities. Like I can watch something that speaks to my Asian immigrant experience that's very straight, or I can watch something that's really gay and queer but really white, okay? And I feel like I have to choose.
I think what we still need to work on is who's telling these stories. I've heard multiple examples of shows where there are queer characters and they've got one person in that writer's room who's responsible for all of those characters, and that's not fair. I mean, that's setting someone up to fail. So I think we need to look at the stories that are being told and who's telling those stories, and are we empowering people and giving them the opportunities and support they need to tell those stories, or are we setting people up to fail and going, we tried that, see, it didn't work, so let's not do that again. I think the systems need to be in place where we're creating that content and we're also giving people the support to tell those stories.
So in conclusion, the methodological approach, the resulting artefacts, and the discussions stimulated by the project itself not only advance scholarly discourse, but also demonstrate innovative approaches to scholarly research that engages with audiences outside the academy, and thereby enriches the research and its impact. By transcending traditional academic boundaries and embracing participatory digital media, the project amplifies discussions of media representation in a manner accessible to media professionals, students, and wider audiences. Through interactive engagement, users gain insights into the significance of representation for marginalised communities. It fosters greater understanding of the subject matter and develops empathy for the LGBTIQA+ community. By highlighting the detrimental effects of stereotypical representation, the research advocates for a more inclusive media landscape that reflects the complexities of contemporary society. And ultimately, Queer Representation Matters serves as a call to action for creative practitioners to prioritise authentic and diverse portrayals in media narratives. Thank you so much for watching, and feel free to reach out if you'd like to talk more.